la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 16, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, Boriken against empire. Borikén, also known as the colonial name Puerto Rico, but for today, we will be calling it Borikén, the liberated revolutionary name of the archipelago of quote-unquote Puerto Rico. And today, we're talking about imperialism, capitalism, U.S. neocolonialism against the people of Borikén, exposing the atrocities of neoliberalism, of capitalism, of how it's sucking up vampirically, parasitically, the resources, the land, and exploiting the people of the islands of Borikén. And joining us today is one of my good homies, Comrade Libre, Afro-Boricua poet and communist based out of Miami, Florida, whose organizing involves theory and action. Comrade Libre is also with the Troika Kollective. Shout out to the Troika Kollective, all the comrades and homies there. Group of Latin American and Caribbean people laboring to counter imperialist domination and provide popular education in defense of the global South. How's it going, compañero Comrade Libre?
Todo bien aquí. Gracias, mano.
It's good to be speaking with you. And right now you're not in Miami, but you're in the Midwest, right?
Yeah, I'm in Milwaukee, which is what indigenous folks call it. It's also known as Milwaukee.
That's what's up. Good thing it's the summer and it's not the winter, because I know it's brick as hell out there. But and cool. But joining us as well is compañera Mercedes Gómez, writer, scholar who focuses on Puerto Rico, Borikén, and its economic relationship to the U.S. since 1898. How's it going, compañera Mercedes? Hold on, let me unmute you.
Oh.
I got you.
No, you just discriminated.
I'm silencing dissent.
God damn it already. Nah, I'm good. It's happy Friday. I mean, I work tomorrow, so it's not that happy, but
yeah, I feel it. It's like Thursday for you. Where are you based at again? You're in New England, right? Or something?
Yeah, Massachusetts, okay. If you want to,
Massachusetts? Okay. There's actually a lot of Puerto Ricans out there, right?
Yeah, to the point, like, I'm not Puerto Rican, but I grew up around them, so my accent is like, people are like, "Oh, are you sure?" I'm Puerto Rican. That's what I call it.
That's what's up. Yeah, I grew up in New York, born and raised, and I grew up with a lot of Puerto Ricans. Actually, the company where my father used to work, it was half Honduran, half Puerto Rican. And me and Comrade Libre had an interesting discussion about this last time, about the diaspora of Puerto Ricans in New York and how they were settled along the rivers, and why that is because of colonialism and imperialism and the sugar cane factories and all this crazy stuff. So I have Puerto Rico near and dear to my heart. I've been going to the Puerto Rican parades for many years since I was young, and have been seeing the impacts of imperialism literally wiping out the nation as we speak. So I'm hoping to get into that today. The reason why we're getting into Borikén is something that has really been bothering me. It hasn't really been getting much media attention, actually. And again, we have to remind folks that Boriken is the last US colony in the Western Hemisphere. Even within Latin America and the Caribbean, every country has quote unquote independence. Obviously, we know it's complete bullshit because they're still subservient to the global imperialist economic order. But Boriken literally is a colony of the US imperialists of Washington, of Wall Street. And as we speak, the island is being pillaged, pummeled, taken over by white Wall Street frat bros who are trading Bitcoin and kicking people out. Is really disgusting and reminds me a lot of what's happening with Palestine and how the Zionists, the quote unquote Israelis, are taking over Puerto Rico, and they brag about making it a millionaire's paradise and a playground. And the people of Puerto Rico, the Borikén, are being wiped out, their customs, their traditions. And so this is something that is important to really talk about because it doesn't get enough mainstream media coverage. And the main thing we're going to be talking about today, two of the biggest things that are happening with Boriken, first are power outages. There have been crazy electrical power outages on the archipelago of Boriken. On Thursday, June 10th, nearly 1 million people in Boriken were left in the dark without power after a fire broke out at the Monacillos electrical substation. So nearly 1 million people, think about that. Like, I'm in East LA right now. That's the whole east side of LA that's basically shut down. And on Thursday, June 17th, a week later, not long, just a few days afterward, another power failure left more than 337,000 people without power after 3 power units were knocked offline. And to this day, right now, I think it's June 25th, and people are still without energy. People are still without power. Small businesses, mom and pop shops in Boriken that have lost all business, especially restaurants. Like, think about it. If you own a small business, a restaurant, supermarket, all your food is fucked. It's gone because it's not able to be refrigerated. There's no power being supplied. It's an island, so it's very hard to bring any resources. So in a way, it's a stranglehold. It's a way to, para sacudir, like we say in Spanish, to get rid of like the last remaining people. And it's very well planned. Meanwhile, the white, wealthy Wall Street banker bros who trade Bitcoin in Boriken, they're chilling. They have their generators. They're getting support. So it's very clear that this is another act of genocide by the US imperialist powers. And on Tuesday, June 1st, earlier this month, Boriken's power transmission and distribution system was totally privatized by this company called Luma Energy. And Luma Energy is a US and Canadian company owned by ATCO and Quanta Services, Inc. And this is a 15-year contract, essentially a monopoly, right? A lot of people in the US, they claim that socialism takes power out from people, that there's no efficiency in their socialism, that it's just one group, small group of wealthy elites running the show and they don't provide good services. Not only is that capitalism, that's true for capitalism, but it's happening now with Boriken, and there's no media coverage about it, no outrage about it, and just another hypocritical standard of capitalism and imperialism. And so protests were held on Friday, June 18th and Saturday, June 19th to protest the privatization of electricity. People are still protesting, people are still resisting and defending their resources. So I just want to play a short clip from some of that protest and then get some reaction from Comrade Libre and Compañera Mercedes. So let's go to that clip right now. So some really powerful images and sounds from that protest. By the way, for those who don't speak Spanish, one of the women were chanting, "Where were you when we were being killed and violated?" Right? Because we know obviously a few years ago, Hurricane Maria, all this crazy shit that's been continually going on against the people of Boriken, yet the police are only there to defend their private corporate overlords, their backers. Why don't we start off with you, Comrade Libre, your reaction to not only the protests, but the power outages in Boriken?
I mean, me hierva la sangre, right? It's like it's the only humane reaction, right, is to be angry. And also to understand like this is all something that could very well be avoided. People have been out since before June 10th. So the problem with Luma is, right, it's Canadian US owned. The what is it? When you call the number, the like to get services, someone answers in English. We're part of the Spanish speaking Caribbean.
Right.
So they're also not providing services in a way that is effective and meets the needs of Boricuas. So it makes me angry that folks are continuing to go out. This, like what everybody saw was an escalation because the week prior, they were actually in that building and they started the protest inside that building until they were escorted out. And this is predominantly being led, right, by femmes, the LGBTQ community. A dope independent news collective called JSL has been doing some great coverage of this back in the islands. But the important thing about this is there's more than double the Boricuas in the diaspora. We need our people to know what's happening in our country so that we can begin to work in solidarity with. And that's probably why it's not getting a lot of media attention. They want to paint the narrative that the U.S. is going to come in, they're going to save us, right? But as you can see, they're not saving anybody. They're just covering it up. And we can dive into like the details, but like also in Aguadilla, there was outages. When I was over there visiting my elder last week, right, the electricity went out for like 4 or 5 hours. So like it's not just happening on that side of the island, it's happening all over. And people need respirators. Like real people are being affected. And this is a real issue, right? Because this company does not have the best interests of the Boricua people. It's also not a union, so it's it's not only is it a monopoly, it is undoing the union that was formed by Boricuas that have an understanding and a responsibility to their community and to their pueblos to make sure that things are working, and like they have that urgency because they live there. Right. So with this foreign entity coming in, pretending to update everything, like it's bullshit.
And it just does away with this spell because in the US, in the capitalist, imperialist US, we get this propaganda from early on. The free market knows best. The invisible hand of the market decides better than the government or the public sector. That's the indoctrination we get from the libertarians, from the right wing, that private companies, when they're in charge, they provide a better service. And this is a perfect example of the private sector and monopolies not only taking advantage of a colonized nation, but also not being able to provide a basic service like electricity. And again, this is a 15-year contract, $159 million out of the pockets of the people of Boriken to these wealthy white colonizers from the US and Canada who are allowing this to happen. And so it's just really disgusting to see that. But compañera Mercedes, your response to everything that's going on?
It's the same, yeah, like it's blood boiling. It's only gonna get worse because the hurricane season just started. So hurricane season is like June 1st, which is the day that the contract started actually, until like November. And people are already saying, they're like, look, there's not the power, nothing's even happened. There hasn't even been like a major storm. If it's already like this, what's going to happen when something does occur, like when you have another Maria? Because it's not an if, that's a when. Especially over the next 15 years, like everybody knows it's going to happen again. I don't want to like jump ahead too much, but it really reminds me a lot of you know, the like I wrote down so much stuff because basically, like, you know, the whole bit with like people having to throw out food or medicine or anything like that. Exactly, like it's affecting real people. It's affecting people who are diabetic. We have a huge issue of diabetes in Latin America and in the Caribbean because we eat so much rice, and you know, the island gets its food imported. A lot of stuff is like high salt. There's a lot of junk food, you know. People have high cholesterol, hypertension. This isn't something that just affects households. It also affects the water system because 70% of the water is pumped with hydroelectric like dams or whatever, and people are saying, you know, what's going to happen to not only the cost of electricity but the cost of water. And it indirectly privatizes water. It is affecting everything, and it's going to affect everything. It's messed up.
I'm so glad you brought up food because that's another weapon that the imperialists use to colonize and oppress a people. And I just came back from Nicaragua a few weeks ago on a food sovereignty delegation, and I was pleased to learn that the Sandinista government collaborates very closely with revolutionary activists from Boriken to help build food sovereignty, because that's something that has been denied to the people of Boriken, because you have these multinational companies, McDonald's, Burger King, Popeyes, that are imposing their poison on the people, wiping away the traditional indigenous foods of Boriken and wiping out these mom and pop shops. Literally now with the electricity, these restaurants and businesses are not able to compete. So their only option is to eat poison that's produced by US multinational companies that gives them diabetes, that gives them heart disease, that gives them all these medical problems. And then the power goes off and they can't even get the medical treatment that they need to help that. So it's just designed, once you look at the patterns, right? And sure, call me crazy, call me a conspiracy theorist, but to me, this is a very planned genocide. This is the elimination of the people of Boriken, and it's just really disgusting to see. Comrade Libre, any response from you just before we head on to talking about statehood?
Yeah, like what folks have to realize is, like, there is no conspiracy. Like, they're not even trying to hide it. The disrespect that Empire has shown to Boriken is ridiculous. All right, so like we're talking about people's electricity bills going from $117 to almost $700. Right, so the labor to update the old system is being placed on the people. Keep in mind, we're already paying almost 11 to 13% tax rate. Right, unemployment is above 50%. Right, like we're already below poverty line. And the other thing to realize is this is also an attack on the climate. We already have a lot of climate issues, and what a lot of people don't understand is 97% of the electric system is ran off of fossil fuel. And we live on an archipelago that's 35 by 100 miles. It's not huge, so like we're automatically continuing to deteriorate the environment. And so there's the question of environmental justice, which is, I think, one of the bigger movements of our generation. And it's what a lot of the elders are talking about back in the islands. Like, this is about the environment, how we have to protect our land from empire before they take it away from us. And then we just have to visit as tourists, right, in our own country, right? Because, they're trying to sell us this lie that we have to go to be successful back in the mainland, whatever, in Turtle Island, right? And that's just not true. We have to. This is one of the reasons why not only do we have to educate the diaspora, but we, as the diaspora, have to be going back, because we have to fight against this. This is not only our people's fight back in the island. This is our fight in the belly of the beast.
Most definitely, and it just reminds me so many similarities with Gaza. Just everything that you were describing, like the stranglehold. Compañera Mercedes, anything you wanted to mention before we move on?
Just like going off on the bit with, like, you know, we like the tax rate is so high, the unemployment rate is high, the poverty rate is high. It's what is it like? I forget how much higher it is than Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the U.S., but it's significantly higher than Mississippi. We also have to talk about how with people who rely on the generators, who gets to pay, who has enough money to pay for a generator to pay for the diesel, that creates another imbalance. Um, there's also people rely a lot on like cash, and during Maria, when the power went out, the electricity was out, so the ATMs didn't work. So who had cash on hand to pay for any basic service? And then, even things like food stamps, people with the food stamp card, if you don't have the electricity, how are you going to swipe it so you can get your food? A lot of people rely on that because what else have you got? And there's not enough food sovereignty. I just wanted to say that bit. I wanted to add that. And also earlier you mentioned that the second power outage was 337,000 people. It was 337,000 customers. So that actually represents a household. So it's a lot more than that.
That's true. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, we don't even know the exact extent because it can be so much worse. And the numbers are always lowball estimates. The same thing with after the hurricanes. They dramatically underestimated how many people died, and we know it was way higher. And something that's simultaneously happening is the statehood issue, because we know that as of March 2021, there are two competing bills in Congress related to Borikén and the future of the nation. So one of them is called the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, which claims to be a bicameral bipartisan legislation introduced by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the Bronx, who's also from Boriken, but we'll go into some of her politics in a bit, and Nidia Velázquez, which proposes creating, and again, this is from their legislation, creating a, quote, status convention made up of delegates elected by Puerto Rican voters who would be responsible for coming up with long-term solutions for the island's territorial status, statehood independence, or other options beyond its current territorial arrangement, such as a free association. So this Democrat-sponsored bill, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, is branded as the Puerto Rican people deciding for themselves. They can go any which way. We'll go into talking a little bit about that and why that's bullshit, and why it serves U.S. imperialism still. The other one is the more right-wing, pro-statehood leaning Puerto Rico Statehood Admissions Act from Congressman Darren Soto from Florida and Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who's Puerto Rico's non-voting member of Congress and a Republican. And the bill imposes statehood to Boriken following a non-binding referendum in November, which they claim that people voted in favor of statehood. And so I just want to play a clip before going to you, comrades, from AOC defending her bill against the statehood bill. And again, I just want you to remember, this is a false dichotomy. Whenever we're talking about U.S. imperialist politics, it's a two-headed snake, right? We have the Democrats, the good cop on the one side, and the Republicans, conservatives, as the bad cop on the other. So this is AOC defending her bill. And just look out for the language she talks about, especially toward the end, where she says that statehood is an option for her plan.
Thank you so much, Chairman Grijalva. Thank you for taking the time to have this meeting and this hearing today. And thank you to all of our witnesses who have come to share their expertise. I am a proud co-lead along with Representative Nidia Velázquez on HR 2070, which is the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. And as was noted by one of our witnesses, self-determination is a human right. I believe that this legislation is the best answer to the centuries-old question of Puerto Rico's status and colonial history. I'm pleased that in the Department of Justice's analysis of our bill, they conclude that Puerto Rico as an island does in fact have a right to a fair and democratic self-determination process. And that and that one-sided initiatives fail to grant Puerto Ricans this outcome. However, I want to be clear that a true decolonization process exempts the current territorial status. With that said, I just want to clear up some mythologies and around this bill. So to Dr. Cox Alomar, very quickly as a yes or no, have former statehood plebiscites and referendums in Puerto Rico, have they been plagued historically by electoral irregularities, inaccuracies, and or have been unilaterally influenced by one party?
And the answer is yes.
So would a constitutional assembly be the most inclusive, democratic, and just process, given that that history of irregularity and bias? Would a constitutional assembly be the most just process for the decolonization of Puerto Rico, in your view?
Definitely yes. And I actually invite you to take a look at the White House Task Force Report of 2011, which basically suggests that the convention is the most encompassing process.
Thank you. Now, additionally, in our self-determination bill, does the bill oppose statehood?
No.
No, our bill does not oppose statehood whatsoever. And does this bill, on the other side too, does it impose independence necessarily on the island?
And the answer is no.
No, it is status agnostic, and it is focused on the process.
So AOC says herself it does not exclude statehood. And I feel like this conversation perfectly exemplifies the false dichotomy we're given in US electoral politics and mainstream media. On the one hand, you have AOC, liberal, saying the colonial history of Puerto Rico, not mentioning that it's a US imperialist colonial history as if it's just Puerto Rico by itself. On the one hand, right, just totally skirting around everything and admitting that statehood is part of the plan that she wants to put forward. And then conversely, on the other side, you have this dude with like the suit, a brown Puerto Rican dude who you could tell like wants to be white so badly, wants to be like a Trump Republican, just like, you know, and it's like, sorry, dude, they're never going to see you as an equal. I know that for a fact, you know, and I say that as somebody, just to be straight up with everybody who's watching and listening, who used to be like that. Like I grew up in New York. I used to wear the suits. I used to be like, you know, if I clean myself up, I can be just like, you know, the wealthy white people in Manhattan, and they can see me as professional and more conservative. And it's just really sad to see that false dichotomy. And that's why I'm glad to be speaking with both of you comrades, because we can talk about the third option, the revolutionary option for Boriken independence. But Comrade Libre, your response to that dialogue?
Well, we have to be clear. The only real answer is revolution towards socialism, right? Like we have to become a socialist country in order to resolve the contradictions that exist within capitalism, that give the impression of liberation, right? But it's dictated by the oppressor, right? It's not real liberation. And so like when I hear AOC talking, I was like, what type of social bullshit? And this is the thing, right? Like we have to, like, and people are like, oh, you know, but at least it's like, no, like she's not trying. She made it very clear that this bill can be statehood. Will it impose independence on Boriken? Impose independence? What we have to understand about this bill is also that a lot of the individuals that are supporting these things are people that have like intimate relationship with the institutions that are colonizing our island. And so like, how accountable are you to Boricuas? Because like what we have to understand is the non-binding referendums that have been used by the occupying US government in the island. A lot of Boricuas don't participate. There's 3.1 million Boricuas over there. In the last referendum, right, less than 1 million individuals came out, right? And less than 700, slightly over 1 million, slightly over 1 million people like went out and voted. Less than 700,000 voted in favor of statehood, right? So you're talking about 52% of individuals. But that being said, a majority of the island did not like, we'll touch on this later, right? But Filiberto and like other individuals will say like, how can we, like, by participating in something like a non-binding referendum, you would it would imply that you're justifying your colonization. And so we're in war right now. When you're in war, you don't use the tools of the colonizer, like, oh, we're gonna vote our way to freedom. No, like, imperialism is something we have to fight for. Any of the bills that are being put forth have already gone and been picked through by the colonizers so that they can cater to their needs and continue to exploit the island. Statehood's not even a realistic option. It's not. The US wouldn't allow it. They exploit us too nice, too much, to make us a state.
Yeah, no, dude, that's such a great point. And it's like, how do you expect somebody who's been fucking you over for the past 100, 200 years to give you what you want, give you freedom, give you concessions? And I feel like that's kind of AOC's role, right? She's kind of like the outfielder who's seeing where the popular movement is going, because there is rising political class consciousness in Puerto Rico. Obviously, we know in 2019 there was a huge movement, one of the biggest I've seen in a really long time. That was really beautiful. And eventually, although those protests somewhat subsumed, AOC's role is kind of to identify who are the leaders there and bring them back into the electoral sphere. And that's kind of like the role of people like AOC and tokens of US imperialism, is to identify like where the youth are at, where the grassroots are at, and to pull them back into the electoral politics. And it seems to be the ongoing game they play. But compañera Mercedes, your response?
Well, first, I just like AOC, just like her existence kind of bothers me, because I sort of like naturally, I hear her say things properly. She doesn't say Velasquez, she says Velázquez. She says Puerto Rico. She says, it's like you have that instinctive response to like the accent. You're like, oh my God, like you said it right. It's no longer like that person was like, welcome to Puerto Rico, hablo español. And it tricks you, you know, right. And that really messes you up, because it's, and like, you know, the whole bit where she's like, we're not imposing independence. And yeah, statehood is an option. But one, if it is, we should look at Hawaii and Hawaii's history. Indigenous Hawaiians don't exactly favor well under statehood, but look at all the people who are living it up in Hawaii and, you know, vacationing in Hawaii and, ooh, it's so pretty, but they're just mooching off of everything.
Yeah.
And also when, I forget, you know, if it was the Stafford Act in like something like 1917 or the Jones Act, but one of those early on ones, it was, they specifically said Puerto Rico will never be a state. It will never be incorporated into the Union, specifically because there is a benefit from having it in between.
Right.
And when there has been the option of like, oh, you know, let's talk, let's write a new constitution, the one that was in 1952, Puerto Rico presented to the U.S. a constitution that the U.S. had to approve before they could, you know, update the status. The original constitution said that people had a right to housing, they had a right to jobs, that women specifically had additional rights, like additional women's rights. Those were scrapped. And then those scrapped, like the adjusted constitution was approved. And then as the new free associated state, it's no longer a colony. So the UN doesn't have to look at it. Other people don't look at it. Anything that's an issue with Puerto Rico, oh, it's just an internal domestic issue. Yeah. And the whole bit on the referendum, not only did only 52% of people vote yes, that's with a campaign that was supported here in the US. It was supported there on the island financially. It had huge backing, and still only 52% of those who voted yes. And it's a huge drop from, I think it was like 95 or something, 97%, the previous one, which was 2 or 3 months before Hurricane Maria. So you have to look at that jump, just like, how does that many people being like, we should be a state, and it drops down suddenly? What does that say about the state of affairs? There's no way that being a part of the U.S. will ever benefit Puerto Rico, because they don't care about Puerto Ricans. They don't care about Boriken, or like, they don't care about any of it. It's just a little plot of land to just continue to siphon money out of in one way or another, whether it's the sugar industry, whether it's industrialization, or whether it's being a loan shark like they're doing now.
Yeah, I think that's a great recap and summary of exactly what's going on. And it's just really insane because there's so many parallels with, as I mentioned earlier, with Gaza and Palestine. And we're talking about a very similar geography. And in this case, Puerto Rico, you know, it's surrounded by water, Gaza surrounded by desert, and you have Egypt and the quote unquote state of Israel surrounding it, and Jordan, and all these sellouts who are collaborating with Israel and collaborating and saying, you know, let's work within. But we know that in Palestine, the Palestinian people have always fared on the side of revolution. And there's just so many similarities between Palestine and Puerto Rico and Boriken. I do want to go to a clip from Filiberto Ojeda Rios. For those of you who are unfamiliar with him, he's a really dope dude, somebody who is very underrated in the communist socialist left, who is a Boriken revolutionary. He co-founded the Boricua Popular Army, known as the Los Macheteros, and its predecessor, Las Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional Puertorriqueña, FALN. And he's somebody who is brilliant. I mean, this is somebody who is talking about not only Boriken independence, but socialism, internationalism, and touching on what we were talking about before about this false dichotomy. Because again, right, we're presented with either this white aspiring dude with the suit who wishes he was a Trump Republican, who's pro-statehood and loves America with 3Ks. And then you have the AOC liberal who's like, you know, let's integrate peace and harmony and let's all talk and converse, you know. So that's the false dichotomy that we're presented with the media. And so I just want to introduce Filiberto to those of you who are unaware, because this is the revolutionary third option that we're talking about, where he's talking about revolution, liberation as the only alternative, the only option. And so this is a clip from a conversation interview with him where he's talking about the difference between a war of terrorism and imperialism and a war of liberation, which is obviously what he was engaged with as a revolutionary who was murdered, assassinated by the US government brutally on the anniversary of the Grito de Lares uprising. And so let's hear from what this brother has to say. I'm going to translate for those of you who are listening as a podcast.
Si uno cree en la libertad.
1 second, let me just take off this banner. Okay, dope. Okay.
Si uno cree en la libertad,
if one believes in liberation, if one knows that their people are oppressed, if one is totally convinced that we are living in a completely colonized country, that we were invaded, that have killed us, that they are destroying our people, that genocide is being practiced from day to day, destroying the enemy is saving the motherland. And we have to struggle in that way. Well, then we have to do it because we are following through with an obligation. And that isn't immoral. You know, it's a war, and it would be a popular war, a war of the people, a war of national salvation, a just war. The unjust war, the crime is the other, the one they are fighting against us. When we're fighting for our motherland, that is an assassination and a crime. See? The crime occurs when they mobilize great sectors and great forces, and they give great amounts of money to counter-revolutionaries who were defeated in countries like Nicaragua. That is a crime, because those people triumphed. The people were triumphant. And what happened? It's history. The tremendous amount of money that was channeled to those counter-revolutionaries, promoted and organized by the CIA. It's widely recognized that they even sold drugs on the other side, and this money was channeled to the counter-revolutionaries. You see, they were also associated with the CIA. They also had their drug operatives assembled, because that was denounced in the US, and it was before the US Senate. What happens is that, well, it's of no importance. They dealt with Noriega. but that which is worse is of no importance to them, because it's a demagoguery, it's a lie, understand? And they value that which they choose, and they have incredible abilities and absolutely incredible resources. But they're resources they rob from the world. They're resources they use from the people, which in turn they use precisely to maintain their system. But definitely, how can we say that the war is being developed by the Black African people in the South Africa is not a just war? Damn it, but if they're killing the Africans, the Black Africans, why can't those Black folks truly defend themselves and fight for and win their liberation, legitimate and human rights that belong to them as human beings? Who has the right to impose themselves on these human beings? No one. So then this is a just war, because it's a war against a brutal exploitation. Well, naturally, colonialism is a crime against humanity. How many human beings were killed by the 7 great lords? The 7 that unite, which are the 7 criminal countries, the best representation of international criminality. France, the extraordinary colonialist country who colonized great sectors of Africa, and even here in our continent, and killed many people in that process of colonization. They destroyed human beings, subdued England. What other country is more criminal than England, who still maintains a colony over Northern Ireland? How can England be in all of those countries of Africa where they've maintained the control, including even here? They went to Hong Kong, China, India, killing people by force. And now the greatest champion of democracy. Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. So that is the OG himself, Filiberto Ojeda Rios, laying down the law. And again, here he wasn't necessarily talking about Boriken liberation, but this goes to show you the internationalist nature of Boriken independence, because a lot of people, especially in the first world white left, won't understand Boriken nationalism as revolutionary nationalism. It is fundamentally proletarian nationalism. And it's something that is important to mention, because the liberation of Puerto Rico is tied with the liberation of the Palestinian people, of all colonized and oppressed people. And here he's explaining why a liberation war, a people's war, is a just war, but imperialist war is not. Comrade Libre, your response to the OG Filiberto.
I mean, I come from a people that that believe in, right? I come under the legacy of individuals that understand that we were invaded, right? The U.S. did not come on terms, any type of good terms, right? And this is what capitalism does, right? It paints a picture, right, of helpless individuals that come from poor countries. And Parenti, very smooth. He says, like, there are not poor countries. There are rich countries that are overexploited, right? And this is what we have to understand. If these countries were actually poor, the U.S. would have no interest in trying to exploit them. So why are they trying to privatize public land, right? In Boriken? Well, because they have this new Act 60, which is a tax incentive, right, specifically for foreign people, right? So Boricuas cannot apply for this tax incentive to buy up land. And so when I hear Filiberto talk, I'm reminded of the general direction that we have to be heading in, right? As principled revolutionaries, we have to understand that the conditions that we currently live in demand that we respond with resistance in the same way that Palestine is, right? People are like, oh, but Palestine peace talks. It's like, no, they're revolutionaries. These people are being oppressed. They're in an open air prison. You cannot tell these people how they should respond. What you can do is tell the U.S. to create sanctions against Israel. Are they going to do it? No, because they're empire. But what we have to do, right, what we have to understand is that we're not on terms where we can negotiate. So what Boricuas have to do is like move in armed struggle strategically, right, to liberate our country. Walter Rodney says, how can, we cannot measure the violence of the slave master in the same way that we measure the violence that the enslaved uses to liberate themselves. We cannot. It's not the same thing. The U.S. invaded us. So the natural thing to do for your country is to protect that country. Now, we can't go ahead and critique those people and be like, oh, why would you do that? Well, why did we get invaded?
Right.
We have to correct the initial contradiction. And we have to be moving to find the rightest, the most correct truth to move us forward, which is scientific socialism, right? And I do believe our people are moving towards that as these conditions are getting worse, because what happens is when people begin to get oppressed, Malcolm X talked about it, right? You got someone on your boot, you're asking for them to take the boot off the neck. Eventually, if they don't take that boot off, I'm looking for whatever I got around me. And in the islands, we got a machete, which is why they call us macheteros. So you best believe that machete is going to be coming for your neck. So, Filiberto, people don't read enough of Filiberto and what the macheteros put out, right? The Ejército Popular Boricua, they have a very good analysis of why armed struggle is the way forward. And this is something that should be shared with diaspora Boricuas. It's one of a project that I'm in the process of doing, working with some elders, right, to get this knowledge out, because a lot of these things have been talked about, but we don't want to move back. We need to move forward. We have to understand where we got up to, and then begin to make steps forward. And that's what we have to do now. We have to get organized. People are already getting tired of this bullshit, and especially with the privatization, right? And trying to sell off our public beaches. This is absolutely ridiculous. And then they blame us for the things that happen. It's no. This does not make sense. We have to correct this contradiction, and we have to fight. And the only way to fight violence is through resistance. And you ain't gonna tell me how to free my country. I'm gonna resist, and I'm gonna make sure we do it until we get free, just like Palestine.
Even like Haiti as well, the revolutionary people of IT who played no games, they were like, fuck y'all. They pulled out the machete and defeated the French colonizers, an inspiration for not only African people, Caribbean people, all people of the world. And I'm glad you mentioned scientific socialism, because under a centrally planned scientific socialist Boriken economy, there's enough resources on the archipelago to serve the needs of the people, to mobilize the people, to have energy, clean water. These are things that are possible. It's not even like it's anything that's out of this way, that's out of this earth to do. We're talking about electricity, running water, clean, healthy food for the people. All of this is possible. We know that Boriken is rich in resources, geographically, strategically positioned in many trade routes in terms of Latin America and also Europe and Africa. And Boriken, under a scientific socialist economy, would be able to organize, mobilize the people, lift people out of poverty, nationalize key industries like Luma and others, and take the wealth of the foreign colonizers, use it to serve the people. I would love to see a socialist Puerto Rico trade with Latin America and the Caribbean, join ALBA, join CELAC, and begin to trade with Venezuela, Nicaragua, with Cuba, with Bolivia. And it's something that's very possible if the people continue to rise up. If they continue to see U.S. imperialism as their enemy, which it very well is, then I think I'm very optimistic that something like that could happen, and that Puerto Rico could be the Cuba of the 21st century. And many people said it was impossible for Cuba, and Cuba did it. And I'm confident that Puerto Rico could do the same, that Boriken could do the same. Compañera Mercedes, your reaction to Filiberto and the revolutionary socialist option for Boriken independence?
Well, first, he kind of, just like the way he was talking, the way, what you guys were saying about, continuing, you have to have an armed resistance. Even when you don't, we're still getting, what do you call it? I don't remember the wording, but I'll just give you an example. This guy, his name is Eliezer Molina. I forget, something like that. It's all written all together, so I'm having a hard time. But he has been speaking out about what you were saying with how they're privatizing and like selling off just parcels of land. There's one really big one that's just outside of El Yunque, and they're trying to sell it, and that's going to affect a lot of people's water. It's a point from which a lot of water comes. This dude was just like calling it out. The FBI knocks on his door and they're threatening his life and all this. So there's no way to like fight peacefully, because even if you do, it's still, well, you're still gonna get attacked one way or another. You're still gonna get threatened. I think, you know, it's important too to talk about not just having a nationalized system of electricity, for example, but a socialist one, because PREPA, as it existed before, was a state utility, but because it was under a capitalist system, the PNP and the PPD, they used it in a lot of ways to boost their own political, ¿cómo se llama? When you're like campaign, they were trying to boost their political campaigns through it. The $9 billion debt that PREPA acquired alone was a Ponzi scheme between itself, and they asked for loans based off of a price for oil that wasn't the quality that they were getting. They were saying this is how much oil costs, but that was a premium. What they actually were buying was the high sulfur content, really bad, really junky type of oil. The excess above what their loans covered, the people had to pay. And I think over a 12-year period, they paid El Pueblo paid $1 billion.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the bonds that PREPA had were underwritten by banks like Scotiabank, Citibank, JP Morgan and Chase, UBS. All those banks, I can't really speak too much on UBS, but all those banks were involved since the sugar industry back in the early 1900s. It was the exact same banks who were loaning out parcels of land that people who were rich in Boston and in New York and in New Jersey, they were buying those lands. They were profiting off of the sugar industry and off of the enslavement of people in Boriken, people in Dominican Republic, Cuba, Hawaii. So it's still connected. They were benefiting off of Philippines and Guam. Those same banks are the same banks who profited off of the bonds, who Citibank was the main consultant of privatizing PREPA. They are now, they still hold the bonds that now Luma is saying that they're helping prioritize paying off the debt. So you can't just have a system that has like a state utility if that utility is not directly for the people. But as well, there's like a scratchy sound. I don't know if it's me or someone else, by the way.
Nah, we hear you. You're good.
Okay, good. I was like, oh, was it me?
It's the FBI, yo. They're just checking in on your conversation.
They probably are.
For real, unfortunately.
The other thing too is that, kind of talking again about like scientific socialism, for years now, I'm talking well over 5 years, there has been, oh, thank you for writing the name of the guy, by the way. There has been conversations about having microgrids on the island, like small electrical systems throughout the island, and using solar energy on like solar panels on houses. This is something that has UPR Mayagüez. So you have top dog, badass, super intelligent, super well educated engineers, electrical engineers of all kinds that are saying, hey, look, we can make microgrids. We can have it so that the people individually own their own solar panels, and the people can own the electrical system. We don't have to have these huge multinationals. We don't have to have this centralized system that is based on the industrialization of the island for an external people, but we can have it for the people here on the island. And, you know, they've been talking about it forever. I actually was on that for like 5 minutes. I have a past. No, but they've been advising the government down there. They've written letters to Washington, to La Junta. They've been saying the system that we have now is expensive. It cannot be sustained in any way, and it's only going to lead to more issues. You do not, we cannot just have an updated system that it stands. We need to completely destroy the system because it's broken, it's dilapidated, it is impossible to fix. It has to be redone. And in the same way, the system, the political and economic system that exists on the island needs to be broken down and redone. Not only through resistance, through what will inevitably be, I think, armed resistance, because if the FBI is going to knock on your door for just saying a couple words, what's left? So that's number one. But number two, I think it's really important that we also encourage food sovereignty and electrical sovereignty, because those are on the way the system is now, the way the island is set up now, the way you got the Jones Act and the food dependence, the external food dependence. You have to have those happen simultaneously. And I think a lot of people recognize that. And I think that's where one of the issues is, where a lot of people on the island and a lot of people in the diaspora are like, okay, well, you know, independence might be nice, but where am I going to get my food? Where am I going to get, you know, the electricity to power the AC or to get the dialysis because there's no medicine, da 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 da. It's going to have to be a multi-pronged approach. And I think in the diaspora, it's important not only that we talk about that, but that we encourage it, and that we look into groups like Casa Pueblo, like people who are doing the food sovereignty, like the projects coming out of UPR Mayagüez. Those, I think, you know, when we apply those and apply them properly, not only will we have scientific socialism, but we'll have a long-lasting independence on the island.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think just going over to you, Comrade, Comrade Libre, giving your thoughts. Obviously, you've been to Boriken several times. Every time I hit you up, I'll hit you up on the phone and you're like, yo, I'm on the island, what's good? I'm like, that's what's up. And you're very well connected with the movement, the grassroots movement out there, more than a lot of people I know. And you're doing a lot of cool things with people out there. What is the situation like now? Like, what are some of the campaigns and movements that people are involved in now? Who's leading them? And what are some ways that people can help out? Because I know that there's obviously a huge Boriken diaspora in the US, bigger than the island itself, unfortunately. So what can people do, and what are some of the things that you've been seeing on your recent trips?
Yeah, so there's a few things happening. Like the thing about mainstream media is it will never talk about the ways in which we're not like resilient, we're actually resisting, right? So there's like when we're talking about the electrical grid, right, like Compañera had shared, right, there are projects going on throughout the island. Queremos Sol is one of them. There's been a proposal to move towards solar energy and away from fossil fuel. Like this is the move, right? Environmental justice. And so that's a solution, right? Solar power. We live on an island where we get sun most of the year, right? Like it actually, like it could be something that we trade with other countries that align with us, right? Because when we get independence, obviously we're going to be enemy number one of the US, and we're going to have to be working in solidarity with the countries that we know have our best interests, that have always voiced that Boricuas deserve independence, right? So countries like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, right? And, you know, like form those solid relationships that don't focus on exploiting, but rather focus on building the infrastructure needed to be to have self-determination, to do the things that are best for our people, and to bring our people back that have been displaced, that have been forced out of our islands by these foreign entities and corporations that argue that, you know, they're going to do the next best thing to fix whatever issue. There's also Amigas del Mar, right? Those are folks in Rincon and Aguadilla that are fighting against the attempts by the PNP. Like the PNP has been giving out contracts to hire developers to build on the beach. The beach is public land. It is illegal to build on public land, and still there are contracts being approved in Los Almendros, Rincon, right? And Eliezer Molina, compañero, you were mentioning him. He just finished being getting the charges dropped. He was facing 14 years because when they started to build, he organized some folks and they stopped them from constructing. So they arrested all those people and they were going to give him 14 years in prison for trying to stop a company that should not be building, right, on the beach that's public, that also would be destroying the turtles that are natural, that naturally get planted there. Right? Like, this is crazy. And you have individuals like Bianca Lagrau, right? And she's been very vocal talking about El Yunque as well, right? Like now I think they're selling the land across from El Yunque in Rio Grande for about $5.5 million, right? So to the highest bidder, right? And this affects our water. So 20% of our water that we consume in Boriken comes from El Yunque. And by having developers build directly across from El Yunque or very close, you're going to be polluting the biodiversity that exists in our natural rainforest, right? So these things are direct attacks on individuals. And also there are projects to preserve and to archive our history of revolutionary resistance and the Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico, which was fighting for independence. A lot of these individuals were killed in prison. Pedro Albizu Campos, Filiberto, and so these individuals are doing projects like El Museo Coltejer in Ciales, right? Which is a library that has, it has books from Vietnam, it has books from Palestine, it has books from Cuba, right? These are whole histories that our own people don't regularly have access to. And thankfully, I'm working with comrades mostly that come from the generation of being locked up and spending 19 to 37 years in prison. Oscar Lopez, Luis, right? Like these are the compañeros I'm working with, and they're building out projects to preserve Filiberto's house. They're going to make it into a place that people can go to understand, what does it look like to fight for independence, the armed revolution. We have to preserve these histories so we can share them, so we know the mistakes we've made, so we can observe these things, so we can be scientific socialists and learn what worked, what didn't work, and then do the next best thing that moves us closer towards independence. So these are some other projects that are happening. There's also a fight to get rid of the antennas that they're planning on building throughout the island in places like Aguada that has upwards of 30 towers, right? The radiation that comes out of these, especially with the 5G, people's health are being affected. And there are also comrades. The last one I'll mention is there are comrades in Vieques, right? Because we're a series of islands. People think it's just one island. We're a series of islands. We're a country. And so Vieques, right? They don't have a hospital. A lot of these folks are being directly affected by the lack of electricity and access to healthcare, and the fact that the U.S. Navy still owns the land, despite what people say. They own the land, right? The other half of Vieques, and they have yet to clean up all the radiation and the bombs that are still active over there.
That's what's up, comrade. And I could tell even your dog is hype. Your dog is listening to all these dope projects. Dog is barking, is yo, what's good? Let's get involved. That sounds really cool, especially all the books you're talking about from Palestine and all over the world. That's a really cool project because that's such an important piece of work to do that's so underrated, documenting, chronicling your people's history and revolution, because part of the war of imperialism is media, of control, of just having you watch Netflix all day, bringing you on a lower vibrational level of existence where the only media you're consuming is pop culture and this and that. Before we wrap up, this is kind of off topic, but I mean, it's related in a way, but I just wanted to ask for both of y'all's opinion about this because it is connected to Boriken and the struggle against imperialism, but also in regards to media. What is your reaction to In the Heights? Have y'all seen In the Heights at all?
Let me talk.
Okay, let's start with you.
Let's start with me.
Let's start with you.
First of all, I have plans. I haven't seen it yet, and I have plans to see it this weekend.
Why don't you break down first what In the Heights is for people who haven't watched it or aren't familiar yet?
First of all, how do you not know? No, In the Heights is a musical. It was a Broadway musical. I think it came out about 2008. It was Lin-Manuel Miranda's break prior to Hamilton, and it's a story on a couple of days in Washington Heights, and just kind of like it's supposed to sort of be a spotlight on life in a diaspora neighborhood, and how like being a diaspora, being Latin American in the U.S., kind of just like what life is like. And it's supposed to just be like that. I love the musical. I'm sorry, like I don't care what anybody says. That is if I'm depressed, you just turn on Piragua and I will be singing it full volume. I got a great tenor voice apparently. I love that. Like get me to sing right now and I'll go.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
Karaoke
I love it. But and I haven't seen the movie yet. I have plans to see it with a good friend of mine this weekend because he and I went to the same, like we were in the play together a few years ago. Like it's a thing. It's like the crux of our friendship. But number one, people have talked a lot about kind of like how it doesn't really truly represent Washington Heights or really any sort of like Caribbean Latin American neighborhood, because that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be Washington Heights, Dominican. And I think nowadays, you know, I'm not from New York, but I know nowadays it's a bit more mixed, I guess, with different nationalities. But still, the culture is Dominican. It's Black. It's Puerto Rican, and like it's there's that issue. There's the other issue where, and this is something that like Lin-Manuel Miranda kind of is just like that typical, you know, just like, oh, you know, like AOC is the best, and we just gotta like be a state, and you know. That's it. And we're done. And because we have more of us in the media now, then we're all good. And yes, it's wonderful to see a story of ours represented. Yes, it can be used as a tool to kind of like inspire somebody. And that can be for one, like, and at an individual level, that might be what sort of makes you start looking into your own history. And maybe that will lead you to reading about your history more in depth. And that could lead you down a decolonial path, but not necessarily. The kind of like picture, you know, cookie cutter, really cute, like we're all dancing and stuff like that. It's great, but it doesn't talk like, and being proud of who you are is great and it's important. But we should also talk about like, why are we here in the first place? You know, yes, be proud of who you are, but and yes, like we contribute because we're awesome. We contribute no matter where we go. We you know, there's like a really good line in the play and probably in the movie itself where it's like from Puerto Rico to Santo Domingo, wherever we go, we rep our people. You know, the opening line is just like, I hang my flag up on display. It reminds me that I came from miles away. It invokes the emotions of La Lucha. It invokes the pride and the kind of like subconscious rage that you feel from being in the diaspora, from suffering from racism, suffering from poverty, suffering because you're not in your own land. But why are you not in your own land? Is because of, you know, the history, the years and years and years of colonial history through the US, France, Britain, Spain, the years of enslavement, the continued rape of our land. And it doesn't stop, and it is not solved because we are in the media a little bit more. It is not solved because AOC can pronounce our names properly. It's not. Yeah. Like, congratulations, but just because you can say it right doesn't mean, like, just because you are proud, Dique, about being Puerto Rican or about being Dominican or about being whoever, doesn't mean you're really proud. Because if you were proud, you would be fighting for your people's liberation, true liberation. And not just for some, oh, yeah, you know, like our GDP is high. Great, your GDP is high, but who's dying as a result? Yeah. What earth is dying? What animal is dying? what peoples and cultures are dying, who is being displaced because of it. And Logan Paul, some rich dude is in Dorado or Trujillo Alto or Rincon, but how many people from Rincon tenían que ir, because of all the policies that happened. So
yeah,
that is my feelings. And also the person who plays Vanessa totally is not the vibe of Vanessa at all. And I'm going to be mad about it the whole damn film because Vanessa is not that. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to do a whole stream at some point about In the Heights. And I actually grew up in the Heights. It's funny because my family was one of the few Honduran families in Washington Heights, but I grew up with a lot of Dominicans, Puerto Ricans. And the biggest thing, I haven't seen it yet, but the biggest thing is like every Puerto Rican Dominican family that I grew up with, a lot of them were brown, black, and there was almost zero black and brown representation of Boricuas and Dominicanos. And I was just mad confused by that, but that's a whole nother conversation we could do. But Comrade Libre, I don't know if you've seen it, but your reaction to In the Heights, because for me, the reason I ask is because I feel like all this crazy shit is going on in Puerto Rico and the DR as well. And I feel like every once in a while, the imperialist media puts out these kind of things to kind of pacify, to be like, look, let's forget about this hardship. Let's celebrate our culture. Let's enjoy, your reaction to this, and just to wrap up the media war as part of Boriken independence.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to give a quick shout out to JSALPPR. That's a media resource you all can follow. That's legal protest against Luma, and Bandera Roja is a socialist outlet. In terms of In the Heights, in the 2019 protests, Lin-Manuel Miranda showed his ass. And I don't fucks with him. And I'm just to be honest. The reality is, what we have to understand is there's an article out by Devin Springer, right? Every art is political inherently, right? So in creating art, you're taking a political position. Like you just shared, Conrad, right? They just dropped In the Heights conveniently. There are massacres, genocides. There are things happening in La República Dominicana and Boriken. They're trying to distract the diaspora. And they're not doing a really good job of it because, like, in Turtle Island, we have folks that ain't with the shits. Like, they're going to call Dominicans out. They're going to call Boricuas out when they're doing anti-black shit, which this seems like it is. So to answer your question, I haven't watched it, but from a political standpoint, what we have to understand is that Lin-Manuel Miranda and his father helped and lobbied on behalf of Promesa, which is the fiscal control board that the U.S. appoints to tell us how we as Boricuas have to pay back our debt. So Lin-Manuel Miranda can go fuck himself, along with all his liberal, super filthy rich people that are gusanos, that are selling out our own people, that was supporting Rosello when the pueblo was out in the streets demanding Ricky renuncia. And, he's probably talking with his buddy Ricky right now because Ricky is in Washington, asking for statehood, saying that, like, lying to people, saying that we are asking for statehood. We ain't asking for no statehood. Sorry. We asking for independence. It's the only thing that we can use to move forward. People are moving more. They're less disillusioned. And Boricuas in the island, like, they're less disillusioned than in the diaspora. And so our job is to enlighten the diaspora so that we know the responsibility that we hold to our people back in our country to make sure that they don't take our land from us. And we also got to support. We got to go back to our islands, and we have to make sure that we're fighting. So, yeah, In the Heights is a political statement, and it's not a socialist one. It's not in favor of communism, so that means it's in favor of colonizing. And so people can consume it as they want. Like, I agree with the arts. I just understand everything is political, especially art. And when I do my poetry, that shit is communist. Okay, It's communist poetry. It's working class poetry. It is not imperialist poetry. It's not meant to oppress nobody.
Right.
So.
Most definitely, Comrade. And we're going to wrap up with just one last comment from Compañera Mercedes.
I got really excited just now when you were talking. So I think, again, going off from being the diaspora, so many of us, especially when you're second, third, fourth, whatever generation, I think so many of us, we long for the homeland, and because of that, we like kind of strive to prove our Latinidad. We strive to be like as culturally relevant as possible. But our job as the diaspora isn't just to be more Dominican, more Mexican, more Nicaraguan, whatever. It isn't to dance better. Our job in the diaspora isn't to speak the Spanish better. It's nice because, you know, communicate with your people, but that's not the job of the diaspora. The job of the diaspora is to remember why we're here, to educate ourselves, to deeply educate ourselves, to take our understanding of white supremacy and racism and how the West operates and how it affects our people and how they view our people. Our job is to take all of that, to take the benefits of being in the belly of the beast and bring it back to our people. Like you're saying, connect, you know, go back. That's our job. Our job isn't to watch in the heights or to be in the heights. Our job is to help our people.
Yeah. Well said. And on that note, it was really dope talking with y'all. Again, this was episode 16, Unmasking Imperialism, Boriken against Empire, debunking the imperialist propaganda about Boriken against the U.S. imperialist powers, speaking with Comrade Libre and Compañera Mercedes. It's really dope speaking to both of y'all. Maybe at some point we could do a whole episode about In the Heights and do a review of it. Really great talking with both of you comrades. And I hope, shout out to everybody watching, listening, by the way, Devra, Rodriguez, Kat, Uria. Peace out, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.
You too. Good night, everyone.
Peace out.